Hey, buongiorno. Welcome back to the Author's Preface, a show that explores how authors and their stories are forged. My name's Sam Hale, your host today. Thanks for coming back. So, what's new with me? Really nothing. Sent out some betas for a novel I've more or less wrapped up. First time doing this. Interested to see how it goes. I am skeptically optimistic, if that's not already a breakfast cereal, and we'll just see how it goes. So far along in this thing, I be quite honest, I don't know if I will make any major developmental changes. After a certain point, you just want the damn thing done. So we'll see what happens when I get feedback. But it's going to take time. 1,700-page book takes a little while to read. In the meantime, I've had the privilege of talking with a few folks, including my guest today, Melissa Clark Bacon. Melissa is the author of Through Her Lens. It's a story that takes place during World War II, specifically in England, where through the lens, quite literally at times, but perspective of a woman participating in the war effort, we get to see her enacting agency along with contributing to discovering the V2 rockets and her contribution. It's pretty cool. I like the historical fiction stuff. You probably noticed I have quite a few hisfic folks on. I've got another one coming up too, so prep for that. Like myself, Melissa's very much into historical fiction, diving into World War II, but also the American diaspora west into California, the kind of Grapes of Wrath style storytelling that has to do with the Dust Bowl, much of that dovetailing with her love of photography, which we discuss. We talk about a lot. Photography definitely dovetails with things. And it was interesting to hear, as I posed the question, to hear what photography can do that other mediums can't, and vice versa. What can a poem do that a novel can't? And what happens when you flip that around? Sort of like when people say they always want their books to read like films. I've always thought that was kind of a misstep. Novels provide all the tools to make epic books, stories, tales, myths, and so forth. So to try and use the filmmaker or screenwriter's toolkit in a novel seems like you're not giving yourself all the tools you as a storyteller deserve. Just an aside there. Anyway, if you want to learn more about Melissa Clark Bacon, you can find her on her website, melissaclarkbacon.com. It's also under the same name on Instagram and Facebook. A lot of cool things discussed. I won't belabor it any longer, so let's get into Melissa Clark Bacon's preface. I am here with Melissa Clark Bacon. Melissa, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, Sam. How are you?
I'm always awesome. Thanks for asking. There's a lot of cool stuff I want to cover. You were writing about in the book I read, Through Her Lens, a period in time that I'm perpetually interested in, which is World War II. And I want to jump into that, the perspective, the contribution of women in World War II in particular. Before we get to all that, however, for people who didn't catch the detailed intro of who you are at the top of this show, why don't you give folks the Cliff Notes version of who you are, publications, accolades, hobbies, education, all that good stuff?
I'm a business background by training. Mostly did that because I needed work and wanted reliable pay. But I do think of myself as a creative person and mostly a storyteller. It started with photography and then evolved into words, and then those words moved into long form with the novel Through Her Lens. I had great success early on with my photography. I won the Delta Award, which is part of the Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts program that they do every year that includes people from the Delta region. I've done storytelling live through the Yarn, which is a storytelling group here in the state of Arkansas. And I wrote a short story that won Best of Show for creative writing, which is where my character Millie was born. And so from there, my mentor group in writing, up to that point, most of the writing had just been for myself or some of the artistic books that I make. They encouraged me to move forward and move this character into long form. I found that just writing a character driven story was difficult. So I was in search of a plot, which is how the history part fell through for me. And I too am fascinated by history, particularly the 1900s. So I was in search of a woman's story and found one that was real, and then was able to meld my character to that. My novel came out in April, and it's available, wherever you like to buy books, independent stores, Amazon, whatever you prefer. We have an ebook. I haven't done an audiobook because I haven't found a talent with a British accent that I really like. And I feel like that the narrator in my mind has an accent, and it's not Southern. So I'm not the candidate to read my own novel. So that may come eventually, but I'm trying to get my arms around being a novelist. So that's where things are for now.
Excellent. Yeah. I think I'll reach out to some of my famous British actresses because I just have them all in my Rolodex. I'll see if I can hook you up after the show here.
I do have imagination of who could play the parts in movies, but I haven't settled on the right voice, and I'm not published through a big avenue where, like Ann Patchett had Meryl Streep read her latest novel. So that it wasn't offered on the offering. So, but I'm happy with it now. I'm a reader mostly. I like audiobooks, but I get lost in the audio. So I'm happy to have it available for people to read.
I'm already taking a bunch of notes here, one in particular about reading versus audiobooks and maybe some controversy alert coming. I've jokingly said controversy so much that I default to it now without even realizing it. So, speaking of British people, aluminium and the boot there. Get it out of my system. There's a lot of stuff I'm already taking notes on top of the notes I'd already taken in prep for the pod, which is to say I've got a lot of questions for you. Especially our shared interest in history here. So, before we get to all that good stuff, though, we will start with your preface, and let's do that right now. So, Melissa, we start with the old world. Prior to writing, and as I understand it, you've had extensive experience and passion in photography, and I'd certainly love to talk about that, especially with inspirations when we get there later on. But prior to writing, were you fulfilled in life? Did you feel like you were good to go based on the things you'd already been doing in life, or was there something missing creatively speaking?
Certainly something missing creatively. As I mentioned before, I have a BBA and an MBA. And while I'm talented in those areas and they were gratifying because they pay well, they didn't prop me up with my imagination. I've found that I had things that my hands wanted to make, and I had stories I wanted to tell. I began doing photography, as a lot of people do, in the darkroom journalism staff of high school, yearbook president. I shot at K1000. I still shoot that. It's the first film I learned to develop. But as time went by, though a picture may say have 1,000 words, I clearly needed 90,000 words to tell my story. And so the journey from 12, when I first started shooting 35 millimeter film and processing it myself, to 56 now, included wanting to tell bigger and bigger stories. I would say the itch isn't entirely scratched. I have more stories I want to tell, but I'm very content. I think Lamb has the quote, content with little, searching for more. And so I feel like that is the place I am landing now. And it is not where I was in my 20s when I was in corporate America, left that to go into nonprofit in the public sector. And I've just little by little been finding a resting place where I'm content with the work that I'm doing.
And I suspect we'll get more into this in inspiration. But with your trajectory, if I understand, you're still using some pretty old school equipment with photography,
Yes.
which is great. I love hearing that. I did the same thing. Some of my favorite high school memories were in the dark room, especially with a girl I had a crush on. But yeah, it's really interesting to hear how quite a few people have actually, even younger people in particularly, are coming back to technology that preceded them by decades. What's the virtue in using, and if this is demeaning, please correct me, but using less sophisticated cameras? What do they bring to photography that the most advanced camera in the world can't?
I think it brings the human element. In the big debate about AI, in the universe of digital zeros and ones, there's a limitation because everything's set side by side. And if we want to layer in the work of the hand and we want to layer in the human idea, we need the analog where everything is layered. So I do shoot some digitally now, but I do large, if I print with film, it's a large scale, either 4x5 or 8x10, because all of my printing is done with hand applied emulsions. So I think there's an element of the hand. I like the uncertainty. I don't want it to be immediately replicated over and over again. When we lean into the digital world, we lose the serendipity.
Mm-hmm.
This last year of my life has really been about giving myself permission to play and not have it be perfect. And I think when younger people, students of mine, are leaning into the digital, it insists on perfection. If we bring it back to writing, the idea that they print out their rough drafts on a computer and so they look tidy, I think it persuades them that the work is complete. And so if I'm working, I sometimes work with high school graduates that are meritorious academically and are looking for scholarships, writing essays and that sort of thing. And I always tell them, you get a legal pad and start there, because otherwise it's hard to get them to edit. And I think that's also true in the photography world. We lose my personality if I let Photoshop do a lot of the work. That is, to my mind, the contrast. Though I think we have a better starting point, because when you're teaching people film, it can take them a very long time to get an image at all on the film, because they need to learn the merits of the light versus the speed. And so they're technically learning to write with light. I think we're losing that in the digital world, because that is all solved for you by the computer, but I don't think it diminishes the eye and the composition. So I do think it's opened the world to a lot more storytelling, but the output can get to be looking sterile in the digital world because it's repetitive.
Yeah, yeah. This is the homogeneity I've been observing in writing. Is that, which was already, that's always been a thing. You have enough
Certainly.
people writing about a Tolkien-esque fantasy story, you're going to get dragons. I certainly have noticed with AI the proliferation of. Uh, it's generic in a lot of ways. It's derivative in a lot of ways, just like human authors entirely can produce the same thing. But the scale of it is really hard to combat. And it's also hard to distinguish because, let's be frank, a not so talented writer could sound a lot like your average AI. And these are just such crazy conversations to be having out loud. I'm still kind of
Okay.
wrapping my head around this. I was reading a book, am reading a book about poetry across the world, from Native American Navajo prayers of health and good fortune to Japanese zazen haikus and so forth. Everything from Rumi to Walden. It's lovely. I love it. And the intro to the book said that poetry is able to do something long form prose in a novel can't, which is it can take complicated ideas and pretty much spread them out before you and allow you to do with them what you will. And then the author, or I guess, the kind of editor, compiler of all these poems, really just stress the idea that poetry has unique qualities to it that writing a novel doesn't, and vice versa. What kind of advantages does photography have over writing? Let's say you're writing a short story, and if photography can convey, let's say, up to 10,000 words or even more, nigh infinitely, what is it photography brings to the aspect of storytelling that writing can't?
I think the immediacy is important, particularly with this generation. Attention spans are getting smaller. So I have a quick moment to tell you something about myself. If I were to write even 20 words on an Instagram post, I wouldn't be able to convey what I can with an image. And often, I think with young people, young women were one of the main personas I had in mind as I wrote my novel. I can get to a place a lot faster with the image. I also think you have an opportunity in that split second to editorialize, which a lot of people don't want to talk about. I teach in one of my photography classes. If we were to talk about, I don't mean to talk about politics in general, and it doesn't matter which convention you're going to, but the photographer who chooses to take the photographs outside of the protesters versus the one that elevates the speakers at that particular convention are telling entirely different stories. And in a moment, if you are interested in having a compare and contrast as a photographer, you could offer both images. And in that moment, the viewer is going to take away something without having to read weeks of the New York Times and weeks of the Wall Street Journal, and all of that. You can imagine any situation. And certainly my heroes in photography editorialized to make a point. The WPA photographers were propagandists. That was their job. And one of Dorothea Lange's most important photographs, The Migrant Mother, the negative has 9 children in it.
Yep.
She intentionally crops it out to leave only 3 because she didn't want her viewer to give themselves permission to blame the woman for her plight. So I think that's an advantage. We can get to a place a lot faster. And I think the hope of then progressing to the metaphor of poetry, which you do have to be able to sit with, the long form novel is to say, what is it to sit and explore as the reader versus what is your immediate reaction? So I think they both give us different opportunities as the receiver of the art or the story, and how we might, contemplate. I think we react often to photography. Maybe we can sit and rest with things in the writing form. I guess the one thing I would add is that while I never thought of myself a lot as a writer as a young person, I have always been a reader. Bookmobile, Babar, the Spotted Dalmatian, Frog and Toad were my constant companions. I grew up, loving Colin and Dickon and Mary, and all of those people filled my world. And I have always loved the relationship that I have with the writers that I love. And so, first and foremost, in spite of the fact that I've become a storyteller, I am a reader. I love being told a story. I like receiving stories. I probably read 2 to 3 books a week. I survived the pandemic beautifully because I'm very introverted, as is my husband. And so we thought it was perfect. It was an opportunity in what is in America a very extroverted, geared world to sit back and not be judged or, ridiculed for the way we would love to spend our time. So I am a reader. I love words. I think they're magnificent. And I love art. I love imagery. And so I spend more time consuming those things. And I think that was all part of my old world. Some of it I want to try. I've never picked up a paintbrush, have no interest in that whatsoever. But a lot of storytelling evolved for me because I participated as a listener to story.
Inspiration, we've already talked about it a little bit, looking at the American Exodus, which is this collection of photography that I'd love for you to go into, because I don't know how many people are actually aware of this. And also just the fact that we teach the Depression, but not so much the sort of colliding event, which is the Dust Bowl. So when we're looking at inspiration here, Melissa, books, authors, but of course expanding it to photographers, artists of all stripes, what kinds of things inspired you?
I love history. I came to it through small museums because I'm from a small place, the Dixon House in Memphis, Tennessee, the Pink Palace in Memphis, going to Chicago to the Art Institute. And I came to know about Dorothea Lange and Martha Gellhorn, Lee Miller, women who were ahead of their time, out in the field, actively photographing our history. And again, as I mentioned, technically Lange was a propagandist. She was a Walker Evans. She wasn't alone. There were many people. But the more I learned about her work with the WPA, you come to understand that there were a lot of writers involved in that. You mentioned Graves of Wrath. Certainly he was an employee of the federal government because we decided we valued that and we didn't want to lose that in an era where finances were scarce.
Yeah, I would say this is a part of the New Deal that really has a net positive. You could say a lot about the New Deal from FDR as mixed results, but this is one of those things I think we can all agree is a net positive.
Absolutely. From travel guides where local people had an opportunity to write to the creative writing that was born from that. And so, as I'm wont to do, as I learn about a thing, I go digging for a thing. There's nothing I like better than a used bookstore with boxes and boxes of well worn things, from teaching children how to read to old natural history books that have
Yeah,
terrible
yeah.
mistakes in them in regard with the knowledge of today's science. Yeah, and so in digging, I came across American Exodus and was, I think, given permission as a young photographer to say that the photography doesn't have to stand on its own, that it can be expounded with the writing. And I thought that Paul Taylor's essays were beautiful. They spoke to where America was, where my family came from. You know, I've been in Arkansas for generations. My great great grandfather came here when it was covered in trees. It was the frontier. Certainly, many of the WPA photographs are of people from the Ozarks, and my family is from northern Arkansas originally. So it tapped into my Scots Irish heritage. So those things were very important to me, and it all starts evolving, and then all of a sudden you're picking up the travel guides because you find them in a used bookstore, and you are reading the contemporary writing of the time and noticing how language is different and how they use this word, and we don't even use that word this way anymore. And it just made me curious and excited to learn more about language in a way that I could command it myself rather than only being on the receiving end of it.
And this might be an opportunity to just briefly go into it, but this love for history, and it's also a period that's going to precede World War II,
Yes.
at least for the Western powers, though I've seen historians posit the idea World War II began with the Japanese invasion of China in 1937, which is an interesting way of recontextualizing it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, did you find this love of history, this budding love of history, even early on in life, or even if it's more recent, did it kind of set you up? It might be worth talking about through her lens, and then we can look at the connective tissue between history. So, let's go into that.
Yeah, my childhood was impacted pretty significantly by the consequences of World War II. I had a grandfather who parachuted in. He was with the 101st, so
Oh, wow.
he was parachuting in behind the Germans during.
Operation Market Garden,
No, he
Overlord.
during Overlord. So he was at Market Garden. He was not at the Battle of the Bulge. So his brother was, though.
Hmm.
And so he carried the trauma of all of that, all of my childhood. My grandmother's brother was a navigator and in the bomb brigade, the bombers. And so he flew the nighttime and daytime raids eventually, and he was lost. So for constant stories that they didn't actually believe he was dead, the searches that they went through, having access to all of his letters. He was definitely my grandmother's favorite, and she was talked about him all of the time. And I had a sense of what life was, as we're talking about the old world, what their old world was like, because he was her dancing partner. She was from an affluent family in Racine, Wisconsin. They're dancing to the big bands at the country club every Friday night because they're all coming out of this depression. And then on my father's side, my grandfather had a congenital heart failure, which he didn't even know about until he responded to his draft notice. He was not allowed to go fight, which also had an impact. So my father mythologized all of the Hollywood movies, and the people who were fighting the wars, and is a huge admirer of Eisenhower. It's very hard to have a conversation with my father without Eisenhower coming up. And he liked the even older history. So because we're in Arkansas, it started with, Prairie Grove and different Civil War reenactments as a child. And then I've been to every battlefield in America. And so that stuff became commonplace, going to graveyards and that sort of thing, and learning the intricacies. Like, most people don't seem to know that Arlington is built around Robert E. Lee's old house.
Hmm. That's right.
Right. And so to get into that and to understand the realities and the complexity of the whole thing instead of it being boiled down to good versus evil.
Yeah, Robert E. Lee is the quintessential example of the conflicted American.
Indeed. So, and he was a, Stonewall Jackson, because my family immigrated to Arkansas from Tennessee. And so it was constant. I didn't have a single vacation that didn't involve going to a campground that was near a national park and,
Yeah.
doing all of that. And I continued that with my son. He was applying for a fellowship for undergraduate school, and they asked 3 questions that aren't on your resume. What are 3 things about you? And he could answer truthfully. I have over 50 junior ranger badges. It's just always been how we spend our leisure time learning. Much to his lament, he's been to the capitals of the world, but has never been to Disney World at almost 24. So that's our biggest sin as parents. I'll take that if that's my biggest crime. But yeah, it was always there. My grandmother was an educator. Her mother was an educator. The idea that we can't know who we are today if we don't know where we've come from as a people, as an individual, it was always just ingrained. And I've always been fascinated by it.
Well, this leads me to a question I asked my previous guest, actually before that, Judith Starkston, whose writing focuses in the Eastern Mediterranean basin in antiquity. I think her story takes place about 3,000 years prior to today, focusing on the Hittites and the Trojan War, which was a fun read. And she studied specifically 4 degrees in history, is still in that community to one effect or another. She learned Hebrew, learned Latin, studying Greek, all this stuff that's relevant to that field. And so I asked her, because you and I are both history nerds here. I like to think of myself as an admirer of history. I'm not a historian, but as Dan Carlin puts it, I'm an admirer of history, so I don't get in any trouble when I
Right.
posit ideas at historians who go, "What are you talking about?" So my question for Judith, and I'm more or less paraphrasing myself, is why should people not only study history, but really make an effort to understand the people that preceded them and the events that they experienced?
My answer to that is because we keep repeating the same mistakes. And if we don't lean back into what we know to be true about ourselves, it's too easy to just run forward. We know the human experience isn't all that different. Certainly, electricity, our conveniences have changed, but the way we act and react to one another hasn't changed all that much. There are things that we take personally and ways that we behave. And I think the advantage of learning it is it helps us see around a corner in a way that we wouldn't be able to see it if we, didn't learn those things.
Would you say understanding history then is an exercise in empathy?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. If you can muster that empathy and not bring judgment when you engage with the history. So, to see the empathy on both sides, often when I talk about through the lens, people will tell me, I've had 2 people tell me now, I got it wrong that World War II didn't start in 1939.
Yeah.
And so, even though they think of themselves as loving history, they only know it from an American point of view, right? They think that it all starts in December of 41, not September of 39. Or I think there's a reasonable argument to talk about the Japanese aggression
Right.
earlier in China. I mean, there's certainly wonderful nonfiction and historical fiction written about the West Coast where they're grappling with the American who is either of Japanese or Chinese descent, trying to navigate that world. So we can't know about things if we can't see around that corner and maybe elect to do things differently.
So this leads me, we're talking about empathy, and a lot of the time that's being applied to cultures other than ours. In my case, it's happening with people thousands of years prior. But like I said, jealousy today is probably uh, analogous or identical to jealousy 2,000 years ago. So, and through her lens, it takes place in World War II, but it's from the British perspective. Why don't you just give us a synopsis of Through Her Lens, more or less what we might see in the back of the book? And then let's talk about why you chose that setting, because as someone who has a rich understanding and passion for American history, now that I know that, your decision to write the setting has me curious. So why don't you talk about Through Her Lens, the Cliff Notes version, and then let's talk about why you chose that setting.
Well, I'll step back a little and get back into education just a nudge. I'm a Nova freak. I watch it every week. I love American Experience. I'm all about PBS and NPR. And I was watching a Nova episode called 3D Spies of World War II. Of course, it piqued my interest because I love photography, and I am immediately fascinated by the fact that what edged out our reconnaissance efforts during World War II is that a British man named Cotton had invented a way to take recon photos in stereographic pairs. So all of our analysis was done in 3D.
That's so cool.
It is so cool. They take the guns out of the Spitfires, which at the time were still mostly wood and canvas, and they immediately put those things in. So I'm finding this story. I'm writing Millie over here on the other hand, which honestly, the short story for that comes from Operation Pied Piper, which I'm very fascinated by because there were famous photographs, though they never gave her credit, but they do believe it was a woman who took photographs of London when the children all left, and they're haunting images. So Pied Piper, which is the Pevensey children in Chronicle of Narnia, they're tagged, they're sent out of the city. So I'm, moving along with all of that. And I would have gladly created a main character who was American, except the Americans didn't let women do anything. So the British, the gentleman who created this system, understood or believed early on that women would make for the best analysts, that were detailed oriented, that were patient. You look at a city street and you don't need to notice the cars, you need to notice the ball that's bouncing across, that then will point you to look further for the child that might be in the image. So looking for the unusual in the imagery is what became important. And so it was a division it was at Medmenham, and it was a division of the Air Force in Britain that elevated women and as a matter of fact, we only credentialed one woman to take photographs during the war, and that was Lee Miller. And so there just weren't a lot of true stories about women who were on the cutting edge of things. And in the case of this situation at Medmenham, it was a woman who discovered the V1 bomb. And so I wanted to be able to lean into something that was truthful and shed light on women. And we just weren't giving that same opportunity to women from our, point of view here in the States. So there are a ton of women's stories about World War II here in America, but they're more about keeping things going.
Yeah.
The participation in and the secret work, the building of the planes, the buildings of the bombs, the keeping the home front going ended up being the work of many American women. But in Britain, since they were the front, women were called to all kinds of action. Codename Verity talks a lot about the girls who taxi the planes. A plane in Wick is hurt, but they get it fixed, but now it needs to be in London. A woman or an older man is flying that plane because they're not putting the RAF pilot in it. He's flying over to bomb Berlin.
It's
right?
The Battle of Britain or something.
Indeed. So women ended up taking a very critical military role, and I had gotten to a place where I didn't want to hear another Churchill story. I love him.
Yeah.
Going to his offices in London is a thrill, but I feel that his and Eisenhower's stories have been told. And, is there a time where we can elevate women? And even if you think about Betchley with like Imitation Game, the movie, and the things happening in the audio world, the pretense that they were secretaries, even though they were doing more elevated work, they weren't given that. So Medmenham was a very unique place where women outranked men, creatives, the people that worked there that were from America came from Disney's cartoon studios, came from all over Hollywood because they were building models. And so they needed a different personality type to do that work. And so it seemed the best home for her. And it made more work for me as a writer because I'm not familiar. But the joy was I went to all of the places. The only place in the novel that I didn't go was Peenemünde, which is in Germany. I have never been to Germany. But everything else, including France and all over Britain and Scotland, I went to those places, saw the photographs that, Candace Babington Smith would have looked at when she found the V1 bomb and all of that. So it just was an opportunity to tell a true story about women rather than an alternate history.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting the observation you made about the different roles women played, just comparing what's happening in England and the UK in general versus American women, which is, like you said, one is the home front. It's in the US, and in England, that's the front lines. And it is interesting to see that dichotomy where we have Rosie the Riveter, or is it Rhonda the Riveter? I always confuse the two.
It's Rosie.
It's Rosie. Okay,
She
thank
actually
you.
lives in Arkansas now, in Bentonville.
Oh, cool. Is she still alive?
Well, no, the painting.
Okay, it's like I didn't know if that was related. She is eternal then. It is interesting because I was just reading up on the mobilization of the U.S. after Pearl Harbor and just how it was like America poured lighter fluid into its bloodstream and just went full blast. And how, since the U.S. wasn't a theater of war, how you did have women contributing, and in the manufacturing sector, I can't imagine us being able to produce the way we did if women hadn't stepped up and really taken roles they had just as much a right to do. And when you see the videos of them on those essentially Ford assembly lines putting together, B-29 bombers, it's just astounding. It's just such an inspiration to watch that stuff. I love it. So it is a really interesting observation to make that, yeah, the dedication goes from raw manufacturing and distribution, though that sounds like there's still some of that happening in England, to we are in it right now. Also, the English Isles, not quite able to produce, not quite as resource rich, though it is where the Industrial Revolution began. And so it is interesting to see the shift in priorities. And also, I guess when you have a lot of U.S. manufacturing sending you supplies, then it is very
Sure.
useful to kind of supplement that.
And certainly women in Britain were doing manufacturing. There's the scene in the book where they're building the bombs and, doing different things like that. So they were doing that work. But their homeward front experiences were very different from ours. They're growing victory gardens. They're, mending clothes, the guilds that would come together to keep the communities going. In an absence of men in general, because again, as a student of history, you have to keep in mind that the men are less than because so many had died 25 years prior to these events during World War I. And so there's already a vacuum of men in that interwar period. And then you run into this World War II time and they had to step up.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that sort of absence of male men, and demographically speaking, that's interesting. When it comes to research, when I'm talking with anybody who writes historical works of any type, I like to go into the research because for some of us, there's a lot, some or none of the fudgery, the historical fudgery going on. And I wanted to ask with Millie, for example, is she a composite character? The characters around her, the setting, I know, like MI6, obviously that was a real thing. But when you were looking at the setting, what kinds of things, and maybe compromise isn't the right word, but what kinds of things did you fudge in order to serve the narrative, and what was important to keep 100% accurate?
So she is a composite, and I think compromise is the right word. Most of the men in this story many of the men are real at minimum. Duncan Sandy is real. Certainly Churchill is real. Her father is based on a real person, the last person out of Germany, who was a POW during World War I, and so had connections in the German sector. And he had written a memoir, and so that was where he was born. But I needed him to be different to have a daughter who was involved and, those sorts of things. But it wasn't too far afield from what might, is it Twain who said it doesn't have to be possible, it needs to be plausible. And so that was, more my pursuit. Candace, I felt very strongly that Babington Smith needed to find the V1, and so she does in the novel. I didn't want to rob her of that credit. The timeline is accurate. I felt like it was important. This last revision shortened the timeline significantly, and therefore some things that had been in a linear timeline became backstory. Memory, telling the tale in the pub, remembering a moment. That way we could have that countdown to D-Day. I wanted that knowledge that D-Day wasn't, Operation Overlord wasn't going to happen if they didn't find these catapulting missiles, basically. So, but I felt like that timeline needed to be firm so that people understood its critical part in the D-Day, or what we think of now as D-Day, because every operation has a D-Day.
Yeah.
So it's sometimes but I hate to just call it Operation Overlord because that, but I don't know that listeners know that was the operation that is now capital D-Day.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to fudge those things. It is true that the British never credentialed a photojournalist, a war journalist. So we had one, the British had none.
Huh.
So that was not a pursuit that would have been available to Millie. And it is also true that this sense of duty was very present among all of the people. And so the conflict that she has, which I feel like is the undercurrent of her personal character story of there are the things that I should do and the things that I want to do. And unfortunately, those things aren't the same. And so how do I reconcile those? And in trying to bring the story into the present for a contemporary reader, I feel that is a common, as you mentioned, jealousy is still the same. I still think our shoulds and our wants don't reconcile often. And so how do we deal with that ourselves personally? So that was the personal journey. If we're using some of the plotting mechanisms like Campbell, her personal journey was one of how do I navigate my shoulds and my wants versus that external plot, which is how do we stop the Nazis?
Okay, doubts. So we've kind of talked about the benefits, I don't know if drawbacks is the right word, the give and take between mediums, where we're talking about writing, photography, and so forth. Looking at the transition into writing, however, I'd certainly like to talk about how you made the decision to get into writing, and then from there, the obstacles. So were there any kind of obstacles you were taking seriously when it came to I'd like to be a writer? What was going through your head?
Yes, lots of doubts, lots of obstacles, not only as a writer, but as a writer that wanted to approach history here in the States. So I'm not a great speller. The only grammar I really understand is intuitive. Am I pausing while I'm reading this? In that case, I'll put a comma.
Yep.
What is the rule for the semicolon? Or is this should be an M dash? Or, none of that registered for me.
The English nerd in me is just like it connects two
My
independent
mother used
clauses.
diagramming sentences as a punishment. And so it was not where I felt most at ease. I know I can tell a wonderful story, but putting it on the page was very intimidating. On the collecting of the information, because I knew I wanted to be in this historical fiction side, we are a very credentialed society.
Mm-hmm.
In parallel to writing this story, I was toying with another story, springboarding off of my maternal grandfather's life and imagining how it might have been different had he been a woman. So an alternative history type thing. So that, what was it? We do hear a lot of stories about the Dust Bowl and that sort of thing. What was it like for the wealthy child during that period? That was him. He leaves home, $20 bill in his shoe, references, blah, blah, blah. When I approached the U.S. National Archives, since I wasn't associated with an academic institution, getting entry was nearly impossible. References, all of the things I needed to do in order to get there to see some of the things that would have been pertinent to his experiences, like being a merchant marine, going to Cuba, all of those things, I couldn't get. I'm writing those same letters to Britain, and I had an entirely different reception. They love Americans, first of all. The Imperial War Museum could not have been more generous. The archives are open really to anyone. What do you need to come to Kew to the archives? You need a driver's license from anywhere and a pencil because you may not take pens. So I was able to go and see anything that had been declassified. I was able to put my hands on, and that was an obstacle here in the States. So that, as much as anything, dictated that I would tell this story from that British point of view, because I could get the information in a way that it was going to take me months, if not years, to try to procure here in the US. So all of those things combined, and I didn't come to writing as a person who, often you go to writing conferences, you meet authors. I wrote my first novel when I was 7, and I have always thought I would be a writer, and that was not me. I thought I would take photographs and I would show people what was happening, insist that they see it, look at things, and so very intimidating. And then the other element of writing that was very difficult for me is, like we were talking about before, you can't take it all in at once. I can look at a photograph and know if it's good. I can take it one step further, burning and dodging and working in the darkroom. And if I've gone too far, I'm going to know that in 30 minutes, not 6 months from now, when I'm now rereading the document and thinking, oh my gosh, where have I gone with this story? This story is not, I don't know how people, they call themselves pantsers. I don't know how you ever get to a tale that has an arc that anyone would appreciate, because I would go off down this alley and around that corner, and you're down the rabbit hole before you even know it. And it gets difficult then to wrap it all back to where you really need to be. So the whole process still today, as I didn't elect to try to get myself agented and go through one of the big 5 publishers, I have imposter syndrome, if you will, over that as well. But I don't know what my next step is on this journey, if it will be long form. And I simply didn't want to wait for the publishing industry to settle itself down and know how to do it. And so I found a hybrid that had developmental editing, which was my number one. I wanted a developmental editor. All of them are going to have a proofreader, right? But I wanted someone to help me make sure the story was as pinned up as it could be. And I had a wonderful developmental editor. But I always worried that I would say to my friends, am I going to be on the, like the American Idol blooper reel? Are y'all telling me the truth? Because it's, I think, hard for people to read long form and then give you honest feedback so that, and do you really believe them? Your readers end up being people who you trust, and they trust you, and they don't want to hurt your feelings, and, all of that. And I just didn't necessarily know. And I ended up just having to have the confidence. I know it's good. Whether it's great or not, I do not know, but I do know it's good. And so that's enough to keep going.
That's a great place to be. It's a humble place to be too.
Yeah.
You're in a position to pivot, whether people say it's great or it's awful, to at least be able to say maybe there's a plus or minus there, but at least it's good. You mentioned imposter syndrome, and I have thoughts that may be controversial on this. Maybe not. Maybe not controversial. Let's see. What do you think imposter syndrome is? And then maybe we can talk about why you believe you have imposter syndrome.
For me, I define it as such based on the contrast of my own life. When I look at 2-dimensional art or 3-dimensional art, I have a sense of whether or not it's good. I can judge if it's great, if it followed the rules, broke the rules on purpose. I have a confidence that is born from 44 years of working in that medium. I'm only 10 years in this thing that I call writing. And I find that in my experience, a lot of the writers I meet are not as generous with their criticism. And so I felt put in my place a lot when I was in the writing world. And so I think that is where I mean by imposter. You don't have an MFA in creative writing. You don't check all of the requisite things that I believe make you a great writer. And therefore, I'm going to remind you of that a lot. And that has been at the beginning, that was my experience in writing. Then I decided those obviously aren't the places I'm going to learn, and shifted gears and went more in a place where I was finding help, like the like Lighthouse in Denver and other places like that, where they want to nurture craft. And that is when then I was able to make that move from I'm going to be on the blooper reel, that this is good and I'm okay with it.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because I've asked this question a couple times on air and off air, just in casual conversation, that this idea that people who experience imposter syndrome, and it's almost, I wrote them down here because I hear it often enough that it's worth meriting this up, mentioning this, which is competence and credentials. And I was thinking about imposter syndrome the other day. I personally don't feel as though I'm afflicted by it. And here's why I think that, which is you've worked in education.
Yeah.
When you showed up on Monday, did you just draw a blank or did you know what needed to be done that day? You knew what to do. It's like if you were a mechanic, you come in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's, to me, I think it's because some people don't consider writing to be a job. And it is a great job. I think it's, if you can get a well paying gig in the arts and you have quote unquote made it, but it is still a job. And I always thought about here's what I was thinking the other day is when I would show up to teach my students, I had my curriculum, I had my lesson plan for the week, and I knew, maybe not 100%, but I knew the trajectory of that day, what I was going to teach. And your first class is your guinea pigs. You make mistakes, and you
Right.
refine it throughout the day. I always tell my kids, I was like, "You guys are the guinea pigs. Your first period. I'm sorry." But I think about writing the same way, which is that this is my job. I love my job. It's great work, but it's still a job. I wake up and I don't dread it, not always. I know that this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm expected to do, and then I need to show up with the same kind of proficiency and competency and confidence that I would if I were still teaching. And so I'm surprised when I hear people say they have writer's block, for example, because I would apply the same kind of situation, which is when I showed up to work to teach, I didn't go, I don't know what I'm teaching. No, yeah, I did. It was prepared. And I don't know, are there holes in that logic there? Because to me,
I
it
don't
just
think
seems like
so. I think the imposter stuff, and we talk about mental health a little bit later, but I think the imposter stuff is born entirely of me lacking, for lack of a better word, the shamelessness to say this is what it is. And I have that in areas that I feel really proficient, and it just took a minute for me to get there with the writing. And but I think that's an excellent, and writer's block was not something I experienced. I mean, I could have written 300,000 words if people would have been willing to read that. I mean, writing tight is harder in my mind than writing, fluidly. So, to my experience, so I was at a book club recently with a group of people who had read the novel, and a few of them were like, "Oh, please send us some of the scenes that got deleted, that
Hmm.
sort of thing," because there's a lot, right? And but I think that's sound. It became more about me saying the grammar's going to get fixed. So please quit paying attention to that. Please help me tell a story. Is the character one dimensional? Is it two dimensional? Is it three dimensional? Are you cheering for her? Do you dislike her? Is she as alive on this piece of paper as she is in my mind? The way the Indigo Girls, the dreams came in like needy children tugging at my sleeve. That it was my experience in writing this novel. And I wanted to know, am I putting everything down? Because I think that's the easiest part to forget is I know her well. And so I write this one sentence. Well, you might need two or three to understand and know her the way I know her. So that's what I needed from the craft groups. And like I said, I got smart enough to go looking in places where I would get that kind of feedback, and got the writing partners that I needed, and the people who were holding me accountable in the face of having a day job, and all of those things, and telling me, you got it, no, you missed the mark a little bit, and the greatest compliment I can get is people talking about my secondary and tertiary characters and feeling that they were well rounded. And I loved Hazel. I wish I could have known more about her. She could have her own storyline. And that, to my mind, is the compliment worth getting, because it tells me that I introduced you to someone that was not only interesting, but now you're interested in her. And we can go from there. It just took some time to get my feet under me.
All right, testing the waters here. Melissa, what kinds of baby steps did you take toward becoming a committed writer? You talked about grammar, punctuation, all that kind of stuff, which, I use a spell checker, and I think I'm pretty hot stuff at times, but it regularly proves me wrong. And it's quite humbling. But as far as yourself, what kind of baby steps did you take toward becoming a more committed writer?
As I mentioned before, I think the key was finding books and workshops on craft. I think if I had to give advice to anyone, I know we're going to do that in a minute, but if I were doing it again, I wouldn't have so many conferences you can go to push you into the industry side of things early days. And I wish I had known that and had avoided that more, and instead spent my time in craft.
Sorry to interrupt you. Why do you
Yeah.
think that is? Because I immediately had like two or three workshops where they just started talking about the back end of the store. And I just thought, I'm here to learn how to write. Why do you think that happens so often now?
Again, Sam, it may get back to what you said before, that people don't think of writing as, let's say, a skill that can be developed, that either you can or can't write. And they imagine that everyone here is looking for the agent, looking for the editor, looking for the regional publisher, the Litfic magazine, whatever it is they're trying to do. And it just feels like that's all there is. And you go to the craft classes and they're very basic. I mean, it was interesting when I discovered your podcast, how many times can you have someone tell you about Joseph Campbell? You're like, okay, I got it.
Yeah.
It's, and so I have no idea why, but, and you have to look a lot harder, and you have to, work a lot more to get with writers who want to talk with you about writing.
Mhm.
Unless, I guess, you're willing to go to Iowa and do the writer's workshop there, or you have access to a good MFA creative writing program. But when I talked to my mentors about that here at the university that's in Little Rock, they said, you don't need an MFA. Go home and write your novel.
Agreed.
You have the chops. Send us the pages. We will help you. So when I finally landed on those people, that's when the craft started coming. And that's when I started having confidence, learning to keep up with my history properly, to build my timelines, put that historian's craft to work, building my note cards, writing my backstories, knowing what day William was born on and Millie was born on, and really bringing my characters to life. And know that I can buy Grammarly, and for heaven's sakes, AI can handle that for me,
Yeah.
right? Learning those writerly tricks. I've got my 10 pages stop short of being finished so that I'm excited to get back to it the next day. Reread those pages, circle every possible I am as are was were be being been, and try to get rid of half of them. Just, getting at it, letting my verbs do the work for me, really stretching my imagination. That is when I felt like I was becoming a writer. So it took time. I mean, 10 years, it's a long path, between learning to do the research and knowing, the protocols around handling primary resources, because I didn't come at it. My son has a degree in history and he understands all of that, but for me, that was new as well. And so I relished learning. It was lovely. That once I found the place to learn it, that became part of the joy in doing it.
You mentioned professors saying you don't need the degree, and I'm 100% in agreement. I think Scorsese would say the same thing about filmmakers. And it gets me thinking about the process of writing over a 10-year period like yourself. I've taken I don't know, about 5 years to work on a novel right now. But I've had what I think is the right mindset, which is I've been treating it like a BA or a bachelor's program just in writing. And I'm good with the time it takes. And I have a host of reasons why, but you sound good with the fact that you've worked on this thing from one iteration to another for about 10 years. What do you think
Sure.
are some of the perks? Because I'm always concerned, especially with younger writers, that they're so obsessed with content they forget to make art. So what do you think are some of the benefits younger writers, of course, but writers in general could take away from taking their time, if it is a decade, on a single project?
If you find the right partners, any collegiate environment is only going to workshop it. So you're not really ever going to have a voice helping you from start to finish. And so for 7 years now, once a month, I'm on a Zoom, or it was a phone call before, with my writing partner, and we're talking things through. And she knows the entire arc. She went with me to a book event, and she was like, I sure hope I don't mention a scene that's no longer in the book. And I think you come to know your characters and you don't get tripped up. And that's where the joy is. If it's entirely driven by the content, getting something delivered, then you're not writing it for yourself anymore. For me, this was in part an endeavor to write the book I want to read,
Hmm.
that ended in a way that the young high school age women that I do book clubs with could be proud of. Not, I read my fair share of romance. I love a romance novel, but an opportunity to write a tale where a woman has agency from beginning to end was important to me, and important to the people I imagined would be my readers. And so taking my time, that is where I experience the joy. If I'd felt the need to rush through, I don't know that I'd ever have gained that confidence. And I don't know that I would have had the joy that came with just knowing these characters so well.
Yeah, I think, the key word there was confidence, and that will serve you in the decades to come as you continue to write. Whereas I'm concerned when I talk with some people, and not necessarily on the show here, but just in general, haven't developed that sense of, well, that self esteem, that confidence that can carry them forward no matter how often or how little they publish, just to, like we were saying in the previous segment, know this is good, and maybe it can be great someday. Maybe it's the next great American novel, but it is good. And I'm confident with that because I've taken the time to recognize what my good looks like. You mentioned research, and I like talking about this because I do a lot of research myself, a couple hundred hours on average. It is a lot of fun. It can really mess up your plot because you find out something and realize, oh, he can't be there. He's on the other
Right.
side of the country. What is in this might dovetail with outlining because you mentioned, pantsers are like a alien species, and for the most part, I agree. What does your process of researching look like, and does that dovetail with outlining in any informative ways?
Yeah, so once I settled on Operation Crossbow, which had a number of names throughout, but the final name of it, as they learned more, the operation shifted and different people were involved.
Hmm.
I had to build myself a timeline for that. And I, as a statistician, am well versed in Excel. So this is where I kept everything. And then I could layer when things were happening, like the mother's story, the father's timeline, every character's timeline. And then that helped me drive the story, and that's where the bulk of the research happened. But then you also have the incidental research. Like, I prefer writing that's specific. When I help students write essays for college applications, as I mentioned before, it's the generalities that kill the essay for me. So I don't want to say we went fishing, I want to say we went fishing for trout. Well, is there trout in Surrey? I don't know. Google, is there trout in Surrey? I don't want to say he picked up a pen. I want to say he picked up his fountain pen or his ballpoint pen. Were there ballpoint pens? He zipped up her dress. In fact, that was not true in 1939 because they weren't putting zippers in clothes in 1939. So, I don't want to do anything that will knock my reader out of the story. And where I can farm out the grammar that might, or the misspelled word or the typo, I really needed to try to get the facts accurate. And so walking those streets, and quite frankly, for the person who doesn't have the means to visit these places, or the author you were describing that they're so far ago, the places no longer exist.
Yeah.
For my money, the first time I visited Wick was walking along with Google Maps through the city. Is that 1 block or 2 from the fish shop to the post office? I got to go there eventually on my own, but that was how I got started. And that became, very critical, for me in the writing. And I got to know the world better. I had one person ask me the question, how were you able to make the world come to life? And I said, it's learning the specifics of the world. And I knew the book was primarily going to be read by American readers. So my development editor pulled me back from some of the British language. And I've had a couple of British readers comment that it kind of jolts them out of the story, but they understand that it's for primarily an American audience. We don't say I'm standing on cue, so and that some of those things they just felt would be too disruptive. So I, tried to, draw them back.
That was my question, was going into verisimilitude and the word choice in particular, especially when we're talking about like verbiage or just how you decided to spell things. Colour. It's an
Great.
American press, so what do we do there?
Or gray. There's
Yeah.
another thing, so we, the development editor really sought those words out. And frankly, so did my cold reader at the very end, who was fantastic. And she caught all kinds of things that other people didn't get. And especially the things that were in regard to being in France. And because I spent the least amount of time there. I mean, I spent time there in my youth, but in regard to the story. So it was just intentional to decide that if we were too specific and I was spelling color, OUR, then that was going to make my American readers think, what is this word? And why did she spell it incorrectly? And so we leaned into the Americanized text, but trying to stay true to certain things. And then again, also trying to stay away some of the language that might have been used contemporarily by the characters is not language that would translate well into our contemporary. Their word for cigarette, as an example,
Oh,
is
yeah.
not something that would be ideal in today's marketplace.
I didn't think about that. Oh, man.
And so, trying to avoid some of, their word for happiness, and in an attempt not to be offensive in any way, you kind of hop off of those kinds of things as well.
Oh, that's a great observation. I was reading some stuff with a student not too long ago, and they described it as a very gay affair, and I just had to stop him and say, okay, so here's what's going on here. Let's contextualize things. We mentioned workshops, and you and I kind of lamenting them, but there's certainly some perks. And did you find good workshops? Because me personally, I found one, Ellie. She's wonderful. But for the most part, like you, I found myself either wondering, why are we in the back end of the store already? Or why are you telling me about show don't tell? This is like remedial stuff as far as I'm concerned. We're in the 072 class. This isn't even 101. So were you finding workshops, though, eventually either in person or online, that did really start to inform your prose, just your process, anything like that?
I found that I had to genre hop in order to do it. When I wanted to world build, I listened to quite a bit of Brandon Sanderson's stuff.
Woo.
Because no one's better.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe there are people better. I don't read a lot of fantasy, but that is one of my son's favorite writers, and he offers so many things online that are, I think, very constructive and helpful. That podcast that he's involved with,
Yeah.
That was very helpful to me. I started the book imagining it would be YA, and so I did the SCBWI, which I did not find as helpful from a craft point of view. Again, as you say, it was the back half of the store often. But from there, I met people who were writers who were doing things, Loon Song, which is up in Minnesota, but it's very focused to children's writing. But I went ahead and went because it was talking about character and the kinds of things, so like MD Anderson was there, Catherine Patterson was there. So I got to learn a lot about how to build character from those people. And so I had to learn to quit worrying about what kind of writer they were and understand that, for heaven's sakes, if I had an opportunity to go sit in a small group with Stephen King, I would absolutely take it, in spite of the fact that I don't write anything like he writes. But the elements would push me toward becoming better myself.
Yeah.
And so that is what I ended up doing. Lighthouse was very helpful I was able to start going to the Lighthouse stuff during COVID, because that was when they went online with a lot of their workshops in order to survive like everyone else. And so there are a lot of lit fic people who write out of there. So again, learned a lot about character from attending some of their classes and getting very specific, writing and saying to the person who's going to do the class, can I see the syllabus first? Because it can get expensive. And if they tell me they're going to talk about show, don't tell, I'm not taking that, because I know that rule. I'm not saying I achieve that rule at every turn, but I know that rule.
Actualization. This one has a caveat baked in for flavor. When did you realize you'd become the author you've always wanted to be, or is that something you're still working toward? And we could even posit the question, do you ever become the author you've wanted to be? So let's just tackle that and see what happens.
So it really did take a few reviews from strangers. The people who love me fiercely. And I was never exactly confident that they would tell me the entire truth. And so as the reviews started coming in, that felt good. And it felt even better when the Kirkus review was positive. And that just has to do with my intellectual snobbery, if I'm honest.
You're in good company.
Yeah, there's no other way to respond to say that other than I know they are not generous in their positive critique. And so when I got positive feedback about the novel from them, I felt like I had reached that good goal, and they were recommending it. And they published it at the same week that they did the women for Kristen Hanna, who, by the way, is one of my favorite authors, but they liked my book better than hers. So that I liked, in terms of, they weren't as hard on me, perhaps, as they were on her, because she's been at it a minute. And so maybe that was part of their feeling that they could be clearer, more concise. I don't know. But as to, am I still working toward it? Yes. I'm a serious person, and I would like to be more playful. And to my mind, one of the advantages of not only being a reader, but a writer is a chance to romp in new worlds. And I would like to write something a little more lighthearted, a little more uplifting. I don't know if it's the times we live in now. That I have a show going up in July for my photography, and it is all about the icing. It's weeks I spent in Paris in the fall of 22. I was a flaneuse the entire time I was there. If I wasn't researching, I was aimlessly drifting through the 6th, 7th, 8th arrondissement, and it was wonderful. And that is what I wrote in the artist statement. It reminded me of the joy of being in a big city and the noise and the crowd. And so I do want to lean into that. And that is something I don't have experience with, because the book I have written was a dark time. There are personal stakes, because the time had personal stakes. So in that regard, I'm still growing as a writer, because it's my new chance to visit a whole new place, not only literally, but figuratively, because I'll go to them. I don't know if we talk about what am I working on next, but, I imagine some bootlegger tale. I don't know why I find that fascinating, but I do. And so I've been to Dahlonega in Appalachia to see where moonshine was made, and, and what was that like, and learning about how NASCAR drivers
Yep.
were born out of being whiskey trippers. And so, those are some of the news stories I want to tell, and so I am absolutely still growing, because there's chapters and chapters and chapters of history that I know nothing about. I know a lot of the readers don't know much about, and personalities. And I'd like my world to continue to be bigger. And I think that writing is one of the vehicles for that.
The moonshine stuff reminds me of a guest I had on way back, maybe pod number 4, 5, 6, with Stacy Hawks, who's an excellent writer and podcaster as well, if people are interested. And she hadn't tried any moonshine, but yeah, I wanted to talk with somebody who's had some white lightning. Did you partake?
I did.
Yeah. Would you be willing to describe it for us?
Well, it burns. It burns. Yeah. And I'm not really a big drinker to begin with. So, I mean, if you think whiskey burns, imagine it's not been aged.
Yeah, yeah.
It burn. I don't know if they can. There's a jug on the shelf behind me somewhere. I don't know. My head may be blocking it, but we have PGA here, so pure grain alcohol. Girlfriend of mine who's a photographer was from Connecticut, and she does collodion almost exclusively, which is a 1860s, 1910, 20 form of photography, all the wet plate photography done with varnishes during the Civil War. And you need pure grain alcohol to do that, which you can't buy in Connecticut. So she was thrilled when she moved here. She's like, you can just walk in and buy it here. So yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Strange intersection of personalities and wants in Southern, we're all a little crazy. So,
Yeah, you got to be if you want to be a writer.
Yep.
So there's always a question kind of coming up. I think it's interesting to ask in the context of historical fiction, because I hear a lot of people saying you must be of in order to write about. This typically revolves around more controversial sociocultural things. But I think the space you and I occupy, writing in historical fiction, you and I are both writing about things that are either decades or millennia past. Do you think you could write about, let's say you hadn't traveled to any of the places you did to write through her lens? Do you think you could have written it, not necessarily just the actual writing, but in terms of morally, ethically, in terms of your conscience? Do you think you could have written that book if you hadn't done the on the ground homework?
I would be comfortable with it.
Mm-hmm.
Isak Dinesen is one of my hero writers, and she talks a lot about, as I said, I come at it from as a reader, and I've been all over the world. I've been to different worlds, different times. Thankfully, to my betterment, I think my world has gotten bigger because I read Walter Dean Myers, and I have seen and spent time in lectures with him and know that his favorite stories were Little House on the Prairie stories because he saw himself as an explorer and an adventurer. So, for example, I intentionally steered clear of any Jewish storyline in my tale. A, because I feel it's been done well in many stories, and B, I am not Jewish, and I just didn't feel that was a story I would tell as well. I think that there is room for saying that some people have an experience so they could tell the story differently, but I don't think it should preclude people from writing the stories they want to write. I mean, my sense of art, writing, music, visual art, is that it is a constant exchange of appropriation.
That's a great way of putting it.
The food that we eat, the clothes that we wear, our fashion, our home design, all the elements of design, we are borrowing and giving at every turn. Country music, I'm a fan of bluegrass. Imagine that the Germans and the Scots and the African American people don't all come together, then this music doesn't exist. And so I do believe that with great care that we can say, this is the way I see the story. It's kind of the way I feel about movies and books. A book gets made into a story, and I know a lot of people will always say, well, the book is better. My answer is the book is different.
It's an adaptation.
Right. I don't expect when I go to see a film to see every character come to life, every dialogue expressed, every scene recreated. I want to see what this storyteller saw when they read the book. And so I think that's how I feel about, my experience, for example, like your experience and mine living in places that were once occupied by Native Americans. There is an influence, the name of the place that I live, the rivers that I float on. I am experiencing their legacy, their heritage, and I feel that I have left an imprint on that. And so if I want to participate in that tale, Richard Peck writes historical fiction for children. Moon Over Manifest. I'm not going to think Claire. I'm not going to think of her last name. But these are stories where there is an intertwining of cultures, and to ignore one because you feel you don't have agency in that is to do harm to the overall story. So I think that we should write the stories we want to tell while we're living in a time that makes room for everyone to make write those stories.
An excellent way to diminish art is to diminish the people who are allowed to talk about it. And you and
Right.
I may have a very, let's say I'm deciding to write, I won't implicate you here. I decide I'd like to write a story about an African slave being transported across the Middle Passage. My thinking is that so long as I'm honest, I respect the source material, I don't embellish it in ways that are purely kind of bullying the reader almost. I think to a certain degree, I have an artistic right to it. Now, obviously, that's a very sensitive subject. You'd like to do a lot of homework. You should do a lot of homework. But like you said, it is a perpetual exchange of appropriation, and the African American experience contributes to the American experience,
Agreed.
which is something you and I have both directly encountered. Maybe more so considering where you live versus me growing up in Alaska. Maybe not so much.
Certainly. But you had a native experience that I didn't have.
True. That's very
And
true.
to be fair, the story you describe is one that no one has experienced. They've experienced the aftermath to one extent or another, but no one has experienced that.
That's a good point, and it is interesting. And I've contemplated this, which is that it's a story that at this point is about 2,200 years past. It's the Third Punic War between the Carthaginians and Romans. Carthage is based in Tunisia, which is the northernmost country in North Africa, which is known as the
I only
Maghreb.
know what that is because there's a tennis player from
Oh,
Tunisia.
really? What's their name?
Jabor is her last name. Jaber, I think is how you spell it.
To look her up. Yeah, it's interesting. Like you're saying, nobody has a direct relation. You could even argue that Tunisian people, while culturally have an affinity to this thing and connection, say the 7th century Moorish crusade across North Africa drastically changed the demographics there. We'll put it in a more sterile wording there. So even the people who occupy that land, but it's thousands, or in this case, about 800 years after the fact, even they don't have the direct experience, but they have experienced the effects of it. And it's a really interesting question. I've been trying to posit this periodically with guests because I'm trying to make sure I'm not coming to conclusions that in my echo chamber are, well, they're just that. And so it's really interesting to hear your perspective. It seems like you and I have a lot of common ground here, and that it really does boil down to respect for the source material, which is saying doing your homework, but also recognizing, and I think your addition here, your addendum is really interesting, recognizing how that has directly affected or indirectly affected you. I don't know, is there anything else I'm missing here? Because I really love your interpretation.
I don't think so. My best friend is a metalsmith and lives in Portland, Oregon. So they're particularly sensitive to a lot of these
Sure.
topics. And she'll face things. She's a Long Islander by birth and rearing. She lived in Long Island her whole life, also Jewish. And, there are all kinds of things that come up that we talk about. And I don't personally believe that I have any more claim to stories about King James than anyone else, simply because we're both Scottish. It's hard to look at me and not imagine she's from Western Europe. I do have brown eyes, but my French friends like to claim that is from the Normans.
Hmm.
And so I think that if we don't make room for cross pollinating all of our pasts as we move toward the future, I think things become even more isolated, and I don't love that. But I'm 56. When I was a kid, culturally, we weren't wrapped up in identity politics. Imagine 57 has happened. They've integrated the schools, particularly in my hometown.
Little Rock.
Yeah. And so I live in a city that's white people are not the majority
Mhm.
of the city. And there's a richness that it comes from living with all of these different people from all of these different places. It's a huge medical community. I have friends from all over the world and, have eaten real Lebanese food, even though I've never been to Lebanon, because I have friends who have immigrated from there. And so I mourn the idea that we can't be the melting pot of the cartoons of my childhood. There was literally a cartoon where people stood on the handle of the pot and jumped in, and we were all assimilating. Now, I understand that those stories were complicated because what we were saying at the time was y'all are more than welcome to be like us.
Yeah.
And so, hopefully we're getting pushed more toward everybody adopting everybody rather than a standard and then you are welcome to join in. And I think that we're a work in progress, and I want to know more about other cultures, and the only way I can know that is to experience it. And sometimes that's going to be through an essay or a poem or a short story or long form perhaps. So
Melissa, we arrive at the New World. We've looked at where you started with things such as photography and describing the storytelling aspect to them, and then that transition into writing and what it brings that other things do and what they bring that writing doesn't, and so forth, and then history and context and you name it. So how are you different as a writer compared to when you first set out? And maybe it's better to say, how are you different today as a creator, as an artist, compared to when you first set out? What did you learn, unlearn, any of those sorts of things in your journey?
first of all, when I first started writing, I think if I was talking about writer's purpose, I think I leaned too much into educate rather than entertain. I have evolved to a place where I primarily want to entertain.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I am so happy to hear you say that because my modus operandi, I always say I do two things: entertain and educate. And if I do one, that's great. So hearing you say that is such a trip for me. It's so interesting that it's a fellow historical fiction author, too.
Yeah,
Sorry to interrupt.
that's okay. So, early versions of the book would have worked well as manuals for processing film and taking the proper photograph. And so things that no reader cares anything about, they want to get on to her and what's going on. And I've learned that I'm more of a mindset that I'm working and throwing pebbles in a pond, to use a metaphor, and what shore and wave they land on. Now, this novel has brought me to this conversation with you. After this, I don't know what will happen next. And I'm come to the awareness that I'm not really in control, and nor do I want to be. I think the story is served by my willingness to go along on the journey. And that would be the biggest thing. I initially, in the learning, I felt the rightness and the wrongness rather than how is this feeling? Is this feeling right to me? And if it is, that's enough. That has been, and it's making it joyful. And honestly, while it may be a dirty word in America, it's turned it into play instead of work.
Hmm.
And that, if I want to just work, I could do different things. And so I want this to be play / work for me. I want to take it seriously enough, as you say, that I come to it prepared, that I'm doing my very best. But part of that preparation is escaping into the story, getting into, I guess some people describe as flow or whatever that looks like. And I believe that it has made me a better writer and a better creative person, because it's a little like the cooking. Why doesn't my dressing taste like my grandmother's? The love, the love's not in the dressing because I followed the recipe. So that I think is the thing I've had to unlearn and then begin to move toward the process of be playful with the characters. Don't, because then that's when the magic happens, to my mind.
All right, goodie time has arrived. It's advice time. Looking at it ahead of time, seminal stuff here, and we've touched on some of it, especially group work, writing groups, and so forth. But Melissa, what kinds of advice do you have for aspiring writers?
I say be a reader.
Hmm.
Read everything you can get your hands on. You never have all the vocabulary you need. You never know what combination of words there, and read intentionally, closely read. when you're reading. I'm not saying don't also read for enjoyment, but find those books where, I still buy paper books because I want to annotate. When I read that miracle sentence, like, oh my gosh, how did those 6 words just make me get bumps, on my arms or bring me to tears? They're rare, they're the little gems that you find upon close reading a story. My son is a very quick reader, and we are both guilty of wanting to know the end. And so rather than him reading the last chapter first, he skims a novel the first time and then goes back to the beginning and reads for all of the detail. And so I don't do that exactly, but I absolutely reread novels that I love, the touchstones, that what I bring to the story as a reader. So I think reading. Don't ever forget that you're a reader. I say buy books. If you want to be a writer, support writers.
Yeah.
uh, don't, participate, help other people read, help other people write, be that critic that you are looking for. Find those groups. If you have the luxury of living in an environment like Manhattan or other places where that aid is at your fingertips everywhere you go, I celebrate that for you. That is not my experience. It's not the experience of most of the writers that I know. So I think you just have to read, genre hop. Don't just stay in your lane, because you're going to learn something from everybody else who's writing. I think that's how we become better writers, is by being committed readers. And then the other thing is, you just have to put your bum in the chair. You got to get up every day and do it. You get better at writing when you write. Just like anything, you're a stronger walker if you walk. You just have, it's a muscle memory that you have to exercise.
Coming back to reading, it always fascinates me when I ask writers how much they read, and they say, well, I listen to a ton of audiobooks. And I thought, no, that wasn't the question. The question was, how much do you read? And I have my thoughts on this, and maybe they're a bit draconic, but what do we lose as writers if we don't read?
For me, I'm very visual, as we've talked about with my photography, with all the visual arts. So watching the words take shape is essential. I want to see the rhythm of the sentence. The other problem for me is I'm not a great listener all of the time. A way I relax is to turn on something to listen to that will then turn off my brain. And so often I miss parts of the story. I miss the details because I can fade in and fade out when I'm in a listening practice. And so the only books I listen to are books I've already read. My son, who is a voracious reader as well, read unbeknownst to us. We get a call when he was 2. Your son's a reader. We need to put him in kindergarten. I'm like, well, he's only 2. He's not going to kindergarten, and I don't think he reads. It turns out he was reading anyway.
Wow.
He does listen, but he would distinguish. If you asked him, what have you read lately? He's very specific about that, because his language is, I heard a book.
I love this kid.
So I was listening to this book versus I read that book,
Mm-hmm.
or I heard this in a book I was listening to. So he distinguishes, but we aren't fearful, of, I have all these books behind me because I read them again. I want to know how I'm going to feel about Holden Caulfield almost every 3 years, right? It's a book my grandfather loved. It's not a book I've always loved. I've loved it at times. I haven't loved it at other times. I do want to, reread it. A separate piece I could read and love every time I've ever read it. I like dark stories, give me a Bronte sister book and I'm in heaven. Jane Austen and I don't always get along. She's a little frivolous for me. But I want to spend some time in, those places. And I think you miss something. Oral language is simply different. I do oral storytelling, and it's filled with the ad lib. It's filled with, there's improvisational things that come with it. And there's an intentionality that comes with the written word. And I believe there's value in reading. I don't really want to discount the audiobook based on your career. For some people, that's their only access to story. And so I would hate to rob people of that. But if you are capable, you should be spending time in the page. And I am again, back to that intellectual snobbery. I want it on paper.
Yeah.
I have an iPad. I'm about to go on a trip. I will read ebooks simply because I don't want to cart so many books around. But by and large, I want it on paper and I want to annotate it. So if I get to going in a library book that I'm really loving, I have to stop and go order the book because I need to write in it.
Yeah.
And so others I just churn through, and it's just rather than watching a movie, or it's simply entertainment and it doesn't elevate in that level for me. But I find the audiobook to be a strange creature. Having written the book through her lens, I have a lot of people say, when are you going to do the audiobook? I'm not really a reader. And as I don't have an audiobook for it. I haven't found the right narrator. And so maybe that will come. But for me, stories in books are like Bert in Mary Poppins. I've drawn you with the cover of my book, which was very intentionally put together, the back of a woman walking toward a disturbing scene with a camera in her hand. I want you to fall into that painting and join her on wherever she's headed. And I don't think that happens when you put on headphones.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And, you mentioned your struggles with punctuation and grammar. And I think a lot of writers whose stuff I've read across the board, they miss out on how you see it modeled. And it doesn't always happen
Agreed.
with self-published because sometimes these people aren't
Right.
fully aware of this stuff. And then, people make mistakes.
Sure.
I've seen trad with typos up the wazoo, whatever. When you get to see that the author decided in a section that was a massive block of text, but has two people talking without any line breaks, without any separation, but it totally works. You don't get that nuance in audio because a talented voice actor is going to see this and think, whoa, that's a lot of reading. I have to breathe. So I'm going to make it sound like there is a pause here. Oh, we must be starting a new line, new line, new line. And you can see how certain people can do this really well. Joseph Conrad was amazing at writing huge blocks of text, but it still reads really well. But you could see the inverse, which is somebody may decide, I do this all the time, I can't help myself. It's going to be a huge critique people have, which is I just will have a separate line with just meant to punctuate the moment with 2 to 3 words tops. But my concern is if a voice actor read that, you might not see that. And as a student of writing, you therefore might not then see how you could use that effectively or how to avoid that if you see it and think of it as kind of, that's kind of a cheap trick there, Sam. Like we were talking about, it astounds me at the number of writers I talk to who don't really read. And I think,
Right.
this is, I don't know what the rough equivalent is here, but is this like a NASCAR driver who doesn't watch NASCAR? I don't know what the equivalent is there, but like, what's the
Well, perhaps it's that isn't there that film, I haven't seen it, where a kid who'd only ever done it on a video game,
yeah
that I think was real. And they were like, there's no way. I mean, and I think eventually he did learn to do it, but it's not like it was automatic. It isn't the same. It's a different experience. And I crave the experience with the object. But I make books as well. So as I esteem them as objects as much as I do what's written on the pages. So
Yeah, that's a good conversation to have. I've been meaning to have it with folks like yourself to really dive into the the interesting dilemma that audiobooks pose. Like you said, there are people who are visually impaired, for example, wherein it's a
sure.
godsend. And AI, even though I'm not a huge fan of it, I think is going to be a big deal for people who want to read books that don't have audio and so forth. Getting back to your advice here, though, we're talking about physical, mental health, meditation, mindfulness. Why don't you take it from there?
I think it's pretty important. As writers, we sit a lot. So the physical, I think, is really important. I solve so many problems. If I'm fiercely staring down something and I can't make it work, my best option is to strap on some shoes and get out into the sunshine. It almost always is solved in the
What
walking.
happened to me about 3 hours ago.
Yeah, it's critical for me. I'm older, so I need to oil the joints anyway. So I don't know how people do it without taking those moments away. If you're worried that you won't get right back to the work, again, stop in a place where you're not, quote, finished, right? So that you have something to go on as, when you sit back down. And I just think the movement in general is pivotal because you could get lost too much just sitting and typing and staring at a screen or writing on a pad or whatever. And I wouldn't be able to do it without having an ability. It's where the character's voices come from. I do yoga. I'm not an expert at it by any means. I can't do shavasana because that's where my characters talk to me. Clear the mind. No, no, no time for clearing. I have something to say. And so
I'm not clearing.
that's right. So I find it essential, and I use music. I think music can bring me into a place. Like if I was writing a big action scene for the book, I would listen to Angels and Demons soundtrack or different really orchestrated dramatic music from
Tinker Tailor
movies.
Soldier Spy could go well with your kind of book, yeah.
Yeah. And that would bring me back to place. Like if I've been working on it for a minute, I had a playlist for this. I had a playlist that if it was going to be Millie interacting with her dad, so that my mind, I know some people use smells for that. For me, it was the music. I could turn on the music and I'm right back where I need to be mentally to attack this conflict that they are inevitably going to have because that's part of the storyline. And so those were the elements that were critical for me and still are. Fitness watch, have a Fitbit, and it beeps 10 minutes before the hour, and I honor that. I get up and I move, and I don't know that I would have made the productive progress just head down, work, 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 work. Well, if I reread that the next day, it's never the quality that I was hoping for. So, advice on getting published. As we talked about before, I think a lot of conferences are going to be more than willing to talk to you about every ins and out of every possible way. I think you have to pick the path that works best for you. For me, I used a hybrid publisher. As I mentioned, I wanted that developmental editor. That was pretty important to me. I also wanted the support of a publisher, someone to help me with some of the publicity and different things like that. I found the agenting world to be particularly difficult to navigate. I think there's a prescription of novel that they imagine will sell, and those are the people they wanted to. So the ending of my book wasn't all that attractive in the world of women's fiction, if you will. And because I have a protagonist that's a female, she doesn't nicely fit into historical fiction necessarily either. There was always one door or
That
another.
surprises me because a lot of historical fiction I read, it's almost entirely female leads. That's really surprising.
Well, a lot of the feedback that I got was, lean more into Peter, lean more
Hmm.
into William, that sort of thing. And they definitely wanted her to have a different ending. So that part was difficult. And as I said, I don't really know where my creative path was going to go. So I decided I was going to quit beating my head. And in the summer of 21, went to a conference. I had a lot of interest based on pitches. As I reached out to people, over 40 people, I heard back from no one. It wasn't even rejections.
Hmm.
I mean, I didn't get rejections. I didn't get affirmations. I got
You
nothing.
got ghosted.
Yeah. And so that felt unproductive to continue down that path. So we looked at the budget, we talked about what we could do, and we decided to take the path we're on. And I can't go do a lot of the other things I want to do if the story's not out in the world. I can't talk with you. I can't do book clubs. I can't do other things. And so I really wanted it out in the world. When I sit on the plane tomorrow and someone says, you've written a book, can I order it? Yes, you can. I wanted to be able to do those things. And so I accomplished that for myself. It's not for everyone. If you need an advance, if you need those things, then you're going to have to go a more traditional route. But I luckily wasn't in that position. And so I took the path that I did.
It sounds like it's been quite rewarding, too.
It has. I have enjoyed it all. And I will say this, the minute you have an ISBN number, the scammers come out of the woodwork. I get hit up every day by content creators that tell me they're going to make me I'm a best-selling author. I'll make you the next best-selling author. You look them up. There's no evidence anywhere that they're best-selling authors. And so I do think that you have to be cautious. Again, that's why I wanted a publisher to help me out. If I get solicitations that seem legitimate, like when podmatch.com, which I, wanted to be a part of, I sent it to my publicist at the publishing and said, is this worthwhile? And she wrote back, yes, it is. So many things she writes back, most things, no, be cautious of this. It's a little like, when you're in high school, they'll put you in the best of book or, that sort of thing. So I would caution people on that. I think that the scammers come out of the work and they are relentless. I have one that for 2 months now, I get a call every day from the same place.
Oh, well, that's good to know. That's good to know. I really appreciate, Melissa, you just sharing all the information here. It's always refreshing, and it's always a great chance to nerd out on the historical fiction stuff. So I really appreciate you sharing not just your own experience, but the experience of women during World War II, at least in one sector, but it's always enlightening. Also, just your thoughts on the audiobook reading dichotomy there, and in particular, who should be allowed to write about what, and what does that do to art? That was a very refreshing take on it. I really appreciate it. So, Melissa Clark Bacon, thanks so much for sharing your preface with us today.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for having me. I've really appreciated the conversation. It's been great.
And there you have it, Melissa Clark Bacon's preface. Cool stuff covered there. I like the discussion on American history, namely the Dust Bowl, the New Deal, the public works projects, and the mixed efficacy of FDR's New Deal. Also, photography. There was just cool stuff to go over there. And I think Melissa said it best, so for me to try and encapsulate any of it would just be an insult. I'll leave it to the professionals. And one thing we discussed, I've had a couple of chats with folks about, is why study history. I think ultimately it's to develop, like we were saying in the show, that sense of empathy, even if it's with people we despise or people who supported people we despise. Better help us contextualize the human condition within certain experiences and understand why it is people might support someone even if they consider them the Antichrist. Anyway, if you want to get away from politics, you can go to melissaclarkbacon.com, learn more about her and her photography. You can do the same for Instagram and Facebook as well. As for myself, Sam Hale, you can pretty much find me on every social site that people seem to think is important. I'm still not convinced of the efficacy of social media when it comes to author success, however you define it, but I do find it as a social experiment interesting. I'd like to think that if you build it, they will come, but I think the field of dreams for the authors, topography-wise, not quite so symmetrical. Having said that, you can check me out on the internets. I also have a Patreon. I'm piss broke as per usual, so even $1 would go a long way. I truly mean that too. That is not lip service. So always appreciate the help. But regardless, just you checking out the show means a lot. And that's really all I have. So may your muse always be perched upon your shoulder, whispering nothing but inspiration in your ear. And until next time, stay humble, folks.